Coming up on Jerusalem Dateline, mounting tension after the deaths of American soldiers in Jordan at the hands of Iranian proxies. Plus, analysis from experts on the potential collision of world powers in the Middle East and what's being said in the Arab world, and the power plays keeping hostages in Gaza, and one organization's campaign to enlist help from the community of nations. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. The White House says it will decide how and when to respond to the attack by an Iranian-backed militia that killed 3 U.S. soldiers. Many Middle East observers believe the Biden administration has to balance the desire to avoid a regional war with the need to deter Iran's regional ambitions. The Pentagon identified the 3 U.S. soldiers killed in Sunday's attack. The mother of Specialist Kennedy Sanders spoke of her 24-year-old daughter.
Kennedy was very outgoing. She was very athletic, very competitive. So all of these different things that she had plans for that, were just cut short in the blink of an eye. So, I just feel like with somebody like her that's so full of life, it's just unfair that she'll never get to realize those dreams that she had.
The Iranian-backed Islamic resistance in Iraq claimed responsibility, but Iran has denied any link to the drone strike that also wounded more than 30 U.S. soldiers. The attack drone reportedly slipped through U.S. defenses because it was confused with a U.S. drone returning to base. National Security spokesman John Kirby promised a response.
We do not seek another war. We do not seek to escalate. But we will absolutely do what is required to protect ourselves, to continue that mission, and to respond appropriately to these attacks.
Kirby said President Biden, as commander-in-chief, will respond in a time and manner of his choosing.
We'll also do it fully cognizant of the fact that these groups, backed by Tehran, have just taken the lives of American troops. And I think I'll leave it there.
Some Middle East analysts say U.S. enemies in the region are sensing weakness.
When they hear proportionality, reasonable, moderate, we don't want a regional war, that sounds so good in Davos. But our adversaries hear that as weakness and a green light for aggression.
Bowman says Iran's goal is clear.
The goal of the Islamic Republic of Iran here, if we're just being direct and blunt, is to kick American forces out of the region so it can more effectively control and undermine its neighbors and advance its radical ideology.
Meanwhile, the UN says it's taking swift action following the allegations UNRWA staff members took part in the October 7th massacres. The Wall Street Journal reporting that 10% of UNRWA's workforce are linked to terror groups in Gaza, while at least a dozen participated in the attacks, including kidnapping, and tracked to the sites where scores of Israelis were murdered. Most of them also served as teachers in UNRWA schools. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken addressed the UNRWA scandal.
It is imperative that UNRWA immediately, as it said it would, investigate, that it hold people accountable as necessary, and that it review its procedures.
Adi Schwartz, co-author of The War of Return, says he believes the current investigation may be the same as many before.
Yes, there are a few bad apples. We will get rid of them, but please give us back the money and we can all go back to normal. I think this would be a terrible mistake.
On Monday, Hamas rejected a proposal for the release of the hostages. In a statement, it said, Israel must cease its aggression and withdraw from Gaza before any exchange transaction takes place. With strikes from Iranian-backed forces increasing against U.S. and Israeli targets, the threat of an all-out war in the Middle East appears to be intensifying. The White House accuses Tehran of provoking the crisis and prompting an American military response. George Thomas has more.
The Islamic mullahs in Tehran have dubbed it their axis of resistance.
What the supreme leader there calls his ring of fire around Israel is to build up these terror groups, these proxies for Iran, to do the fighting for Iran so that Iran doesn't have anybody come knocking on its doorstep.
Since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, Iranian proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen have dramatically upped their strikes against Israel and U.S. interests in the region.
Iran didn't arm and equip and train and finance the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, Shia militia groups in Iraq to use these resources for their own benefit at their own discretion. Iran did all that so it would have a capability through its proxies to act as it's acting now.
The U.S. responding with attacks on the proxy militias.
We have taken military action against sites in Iraq and Syria that are also tied to the IRGC, which supports these militias. We have said quite clearly that we hold Iran responsible for the groups, the proxies that it supports and that it provides weapons to.
Iran's Revolutionary Guard forces in just the past week have also launched direct attacks on 3 of their close neighbors, Iraq, Syria, and Pakistan. These multiple flashpoints now causing concern of a much broader conflict pitting Iran and its allies against Israel and the United States.
It just shows just how dangerous the situation is in the wider Middle East.
It's all part of their strategy, but ultimately, they want us to be fighting these tentacles so that we get bogged down and distracted. What we really need to focus on is the head of the octopus, and that's Iran.
Iranian-backed militias have launched more than 140 rocket and drone attacks against U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria since October 7th. The most serious attack happening at the Al-Assad airbase in western Iraq this past weekend. CENTCOM reporting that a number of U.S. personnel sustained traumatic brain injuries.
It was a very serious attack using a capability, ballistic missiles that pose a genuine threat.
Richard Goldberg, who handled the Iranian portfolio at the White House National Security Council, says such actions show Iran is clearly undeterred and has no reason to rein in its proxies, whether it's Houthi rebels targeting shipping vessels in the Red Sea or militias attacking our U.S. troops in Syria.
But remember, Iran is looking at the big picture here. And the Biden administration's policy is still to give money to Iran while all of this is going on. We have $10 billion flowing from a Biden sanctions waiver today that the Iranians are benefiting from.
George Thomas, CBN News.
Up next, a former Israeli intelligence officer gives his perspective on escalating hostilities from across Israel's borders. As a former Israeli intelligence officer, Avi Melamed looks at the big picture power plays within the Middle East. We asked him recently about his perspective on what's going on within Gaza and around Israel's borders. Take a look. How would you describe the Middle East right now? You have so many issues going on. The attack on the U.S. bases, Iranian and backed militias in Syria and Iraq. The IDF having a large-scale exercise on a possible invasion of Lebanon against Hezbollah. You still have the conflict with Hamas and Gaza, and you have the Houthis as well. Can you describe how volatile the region is right now?
It's very volatile. Actually, what we see is right now the manifestation of a process that has been brewing for some period of now in the region. And basically what I'm talking about is that what we see today across the Middle East is almost one step before the direct collision between major powers, the Western powers and Israel and the Iranian regime, because what we see today around the region is exactly the manifestation of the Iranian regime ambition to become the superpower in the region, with all the ramifications that comes along with that. So what we see in Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in the Red Sea, in the end of the day, all the strings are leading to one location only, and this is Tehran. This is the mullah regime in Tehran. We have today sample of the disastrous vision and future that waits the Middle East and the world if the mullah regime is not going to be restrained forcefully.
Wow. What's your analysis, assessment right now of the IDF advance inside Gaza? Apparently they're taking over much of Khan Yunis and encircling it. Where do you see that military campaign right now?
Well, Chris, it seems based upon the reports coming in that the IDF is doing a good progress with this whole military plan. Is kind of like circling around the major strongholds of Hamas inside Gaza Strip, particularly Khan Yunis, the birthplace of Gaza, of Hamas, and estimated also to be the place where maybe senior Hamas leader as well as the hostages are being held in the tunnels of Hamas.
There's talk about maybe a 2-month pause in the possible negotiations to release those hostages. What impact would that have on the Israeli military campaign?
Well, there are different opinions on that. Some says that it's basically going to stop the momentum. Some says that actually it will play to the hands of the Israeli military planners because it will enable Israel to regroup itself, to replan, to readjust itself to the situation on the ground. We have to remember we are looking at a very dynamic situation because the fight at some parts in Gaza Strip, and particularly Khan Yunis, the fight is taking place very close to the civilians in Gaza Strip. There are many civilians that left in Khan Yunis. This is different from the story that was in the northern part of Gaza Strip. Parallel to that, we also see a situation where such a pause would cause Hamas fighters to reposition themselves, maybe emerging out from tunnels they're locating, maybe trying to set a new position. That will provide Israel with more and more intelligence on the ground, operational intelligence. So it depends. I mean, you got different opinions on that, but I think that roughly speaking in the IDF, there is no objection to the idea of a pause because it seems like that the advantages of such pause could be bigger than the downsides.
Yeah, great analysis, Avi. If people want to learn more about your website, what you're doing, how can they get in touch with you or learn more about your organization?
Sure, they can go to our website. It's called www.inside the Middle East. There is a lot of analysis, up-to-date analysis, visual information, and so on and so on.
Great to be with you, Avi. Thanks so much for your analysis and expertise. Coming up, the founder of the organization that's helped the world for decades to understand what's being said in the Arab world. The Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, has been around for more than 2 decades, helping the West understand what's being said in the Arab Muslim world. We spoke with its founder and president, Yigal Karman, in our studio the other day about what led him to establish MEMRI in the first place. Yigal Karman, you're the president and the co-founder of MEMRI, 25 years now. And it's an amazing service that I know people that use it all over the world. Tell us how it started and what was its purpose and its mission.
Thank you. Well, it started 25 years ago with the notion that the world, the Western world, needs to know what is the Arab and Muslim world about. And you can only know that from reading the media to understand the present, reading the school books to understand the future. Whatever is taught now will surface in a few years. And the idea was to bridge the language gap. Because I realized after long service in the military intelligence that people don't understand, not because they don't know secrets, but because they don't know what is all around, open for them to know. Generally speaking, the people are trying to modernize, particularly in America, to have a new life, modernized life, westernized life. But there is a villain entity, I call it the entity of evil, Qatar, that drags them back to Islam of the 7th century. Not the Islam that could be moderate and modern and enlightened. No, they drag them back to the 7th century Islam. That is Qatar, by funding with their billions of dollars, universities, centers of culture.
You know, one of the first interviews I did when I came here in the year 2000 was with you, up the street. And you made something that I've never forgotten. You said, don't listen to what they say in English, listen to what they say in Arabic at the time. And what impact has MEMRI had, not only by really opening up the whole dialogue about the Arab-Israeli conflict?
Yeah, we opened the eyes of people. Of course, there are some who are reluctant to open them. There are those who don't want to to see the reality, but they are forced to, because the reality has more faces, not only what is being said, taught, preached, but also, at the end of the day, it's wars, it's violence all over. Look at the Arab world, where there isn't war and violence, whether domestic or external. So we try to show the basic reason, the messages that are being taught, particularly school books. School books in which they say everything, jihad and martyrdom. You go to kill and you die in killing others, that's where you go to paradise. It's tough, it's really tough, and people consider that because the religious leaders are telling them that, they consider it to be good. I'll give you an example that is horrific. A suicide bomber, it's not suicide of course, it's a jihadi act. A month before he is going to do his act, which is bomb himself in a restaurant, in a place, man or woman, the last month before, he becomes good. He helps society, he helps people, he prays several times a day. He is what is considered good. And the ultimate good is blow yourself in a restaurant on innocent people. And that's the good. It's so tough for people, for Christians, to understand that. It's a mind-boggling reversal of any humanity.
And you say that the textbooks really, you see that happening a generation later, you see the fruit of it happening a generation.
You know, you see the textbooks, you know what's coming.
Yeah. Do you think people in the West underestimate the religious nature of what's happening here in the Middle East?
Definitely, because the West ceased to be religious. In general, I'm speaking, I'm not giving any data, but I guess you know that people are less attached to the values of religion, unfortunately so.
And here in the Middle East, we have people driven by this religion.
To the worst possible translation of it into life, actually into death. I'll give you an example. What is being reiterated and on and on and on and on. When the Caliph Abu Bakr sent his commander of the army, Khalid ibn al-Walid, to fight the Persians, he came with a letter. And the content of this letter became viral over history. The letter said, convert to Islam and you will be safe, or else you should know that I came to you with a people who love death as much as you love life. This is the essence. And this sentence is everywhere. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, everybody, such a pride. As much as you love life, we love death. Oh,
yeah. And that was Abu Bakr up in the 7th century.
7th century.
And it's here today in 20.
Yes.
Yigal Kamran, thanks so much for joining us. Invaluable service with memory. I know many of my friends around the world take advantage of what you do to give us insight into what's happening. Thank you so much for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline.
Thank you.
Still ahead, giving voice to the captives, advocating for the hostages still held in Gaza. Our next guest has a countdown clock on his website showing how long the hostages have been held in Gaza, down to the minute and second. His focus on the urgency of their plight fuels his campaign around the world to enlist help in getting them freed. He spoke with us recently with an update on what his organization, voiceforfreedom.org, has been doing. Caleb Myers, thanks for joining us. You're the founder of Voice for Freedom. It's been a while since we've talked. Tell us what your organization is doing right now.
Around 250 people were kidnapped and brought into captivity in the hands of Hamas. Right now, there's still 136 of them left in captivity. From what we know, 26 of them are no longer alive. We hope that the 110 other hostages are still alive. That would include 18 people over the age of 60, toddlers, one is a toddler, one is a baby, men and women. We know that they're being kept in horrendous circumstances based on the testimony of those who've been released.
What key role does Qatar provide in this negotiation about the hostages as well as Hamas?
Qatar is really key to releasing the hostages. If they have leverage over Hamas, because all of Hamas's senior leadership lives in Qatar, they've also been giving Hamas over $350 million a year over the last few years. And so if Qatar wants all the hostages to be released, all the hostages will be released. Qatar has been playing this game for many years, Chris, where on one hand, it's giving hundreds of millions of dollars to a terrorist organization, which then carries out, horrific acts like we saw on October 7th. On the other hand, it wants to maintain a good relationship with the West. Just a few days ago, the United States government decided to renew the deal to put the U.S.'s largest military base outside of U.S. soil in Qatar. So it renewed that for another 10 years. We feel like the world needs to have a serious conversation with Qatar and say that it needs to make a choice. Either it should be aligned with the West and Western values, people who appreciate life, protect life, or it's aligned with the terrorist organizations, in which case it should be boycotted by Western governments and Western societies.
What's the strategy you're involved in at the moment to bring the hostages home?
We've been taking these delegations of family members of hostages to tell their story around the world. We were in Geneva, Washington, D.C., Brussels, Strasbourg, Paris, London, and Madrid, meeting with decision makers and international media. We are trying to keep the pressure on Qatar.
Caleb Myers, founder of voiceforfreedom.org. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for all you're doing for the hostages' release. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And please continue to pray for the safety of IDF soldiers, all those caught in harm's way, and for the safe return of all the hostages. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.